So I'm Dan Hoare, and thank you to South Year Wildlife Group for setting up this evening. So it's nice to come along and have a talk with you guys. So in terms of my talk today, I've sort of teased it a little bit. We're going to be talking about water plants, particularly in the Broads. So the title of the talk today then is Flourishing, Flora and Invasive Intruders, Navigating the Dynamics of Aquatic Ecosystems. So it's quite a niche topic, possibly, so I'm glad you've all come out and want to have a listen to this. If there's, I'm trying not to pitch this and be too highbrow and go deep into the science. So if there's anything you're not sure of, or you've got any questions at any point, just stick your hand up and shout out. We can make this sort of interactive, so anything you're not sure of, let me know. So in terms of flourishing flora and invasive intruders, particularly around water plants, I was thinking, well, how do I come up with a title for this talk? And I had a bit of a block, really, because the good, bad, the ugly, thinking of invasive species. So in the end, I just Googled what I wanted to put into, or I wrote down what I wanted the talk to be about and put it into one of the AI chat GPT software. So you can judge me here, but this is actually from that. This is what it spat out. And I thought, that's a really good title. I'm going to use it. So I was discussing this with my mother-in-law, who's a teacher, and she was outraged. She said, that's morally corrupt. You can't. It's like plagiarism. I had to share that with you. Otherwise, I'd feel guilty and upset Susie. So, yes, whilst I may well have, fed the algorithm and given it what I was thinking, the actual words is the internet and AI is a bit like a overly clever thesaurus, isn't it? So, I did Google it just to see if it, have I just robbed this from someone else who's done a talk in Brazil or something? But it's not. It seems to be genuinely entirely unique. So it's just for you, look, from the world of AI. So in terms of me then, I'm sort of semi-representing my employer today, mainly because most of the information and the opportunity to get out on the Broads has come through my work with the Broads Authority. So my current role is Head of Construction, Maintenance and Ecology. So in normal speak, that's probably Operations Manager. So I get to currently manage all aspects of the practical delivery of managing a national park. So all the river waterways management, a lot of the visitor infrastructure on land, all of the Broads Authority's assets, and then the conservation management across fen habitats, wet woodland, and some of the water bodies as well. So that covers, well, several teams who actually cover the whole of the Broads area. I mainly sit behind a desk now, so this is the joy of management. So that's me. And if this works, I'll be able to make the slides turn with my magic device. Duh. There we go. The light's on. Someone's home. Yes. So I wanted to try and keep this fairly local. So who knows where this is? Who can tell me? Oh, yeah, I heard a wheat fen. What's the Broad there at the top? And what's the river called? Yes, okay, so this is us. This is a prime location for water plants in the South Yare patch. So highly relevant. Well, I hope it is. So in terms of why I put this slide up is because myself and Rose, my wife, is here. We live in the house here in the corner on the edge of Wheat Fen, which is just there. So and Rebecca is here as well, who's the assistant warden with Ted Ellis Trust at Wheat Fen. So I brought the crew with me tonight. And in terms of habitats and the environment for water plants, Rockland Broad itself is fantastic. The River Yare is pretty good. Wheat Fen's, of course, the best place in the country nearly. Well, it could be if you. But yeah, in terms of the channels, the connectivity, the water, the ditch network, the sort of the management that goes into it, and the protection of this area, there's still remnants of a much bigger broadland swamp of many centuries and decades ago. So some of these species are still here. So it's not all doom and gloom tonight by any means. So yeah, this is the sort of environment we're talking about. We all love wetlands. So, water plants. This slide is one that you can kind of channel your mind now. If you think about being underwater, this is the sort of view of your habitat. If you're I don't know, some sort of water beetle or something, you can sort of meditate on this for a second and just think about yourself as an aquatic organism, and all the things you need for life are all around you. You've got a bit of oxygen in the water, you've got nutrients in the sediment, and you're there growing in that environment. And one thing about water plants is plants that grow in the air, so imagine trees, they need to be fairly stiff and sturdy to cope with winds and to support their own body weight. But water plants, they've got the water to support them, and if you've got floating leaves like a lily, you know, your stems can be quite flimsy. So a lot of the water plants that are going around the room and on the table here, there's not a lot to them really. So they're quite soft. You know, they don't have hard cellulose stems a lot. So this type of soft aquatic environment is sort of where we're inhabiting today. So again, if we go back in time, it's one of Emerson's photos in the Broads, gathering the water lilies, this one. So again, this is a typical scene on the edge of Broads, maybe 100, 200 years ago, with the emergent reed, bulrush, reed mace, and then your floating plants of the lilies, and then a whole array of different submerged water plants would have been present in those days. And we know this not only from some of the photos, but you know, this is even Barton Broad from a postcard. I'm not sure of the date of the postcard, but I could imagine early 1900s. And again, this Barton Broad doesn't look like this today. There's far more open water. A lot of the bulrush has disappeared and is in a few remnant corners in Barton. There's not quite as many water lilies, though they are present. So historically, the Broads themselves and the rivers and a lot of the dike network would have had far more water plants than they do today. And again, just to bring it back to close to home, so there is the remnants of this skeleton or smock mill down in the corner. It's sort of behind the bird hide, somewhere in there. Some of you may know where that is more than me. So this view of Rockland Broad is sort of into that corner near where the RSPB bird hide is. And what you can see on this one, so I think this is a colorized photo, so this would have been a photograph. And you've got all of these sort of spiky plants sticking out here. You've got some lilies, presumably, but this is all water soldier. So water soldier, say through the mid 1900s onwards, 1960s onwards, really only existed in some of the grazing marsh dikes, and it was really lost from these swampy edge habitats around the edges of the Broads. So to have this sort of photo from the time, and again, this is early 1900s. I think I've seen a copy of this postcard with Edward VII stamp on, so it's from that time, 1910s, early 1900s. So again, that's some of the sort of history of water plants in the Broads. And in terms of sort of the Edgewardian naturalists' collections and people going out botanising, water plants were, you know, all the rage. There was a sort of an area in the Broads was renowned for a range of different species going out and cataloguing them from different sites. So the Broads has got sort of a rich history really of water plant knowledge and records particularly, and people's writings and naturalists' efforts. So we know what was there. And then we fast forward a bit. So in my stamp collection, I was sort of going through things and noticing, well, it's a nice stamp of a shelduck. But then I was actually thinking about it, what is it? And I hadn't even noticed this. So this has been my stamp collection for years. But this is actually, if you read the writing on the side, this was from the Ramsar Convention, which, if any of you have heard of this, it was sort of the first international wetland inventory really of looking at sites around the world that were particularly important for their wetland biology, particularly birds, and lots of places around the world were identified. So two of them being, one was Breydon Water here over near Yarmouth, and another one was the Broadland Ramsar, which covered most of the big open water broads in the Ant and Bure valleys and in the Yare Valley. So this is in 1971. It got to such a state in many freshwaters and wetlands around the world that the conservationists and the ecologists and people who were keen on this and understood the value of the biodiversity then realised that we need to place some protection on these areas. And in some ways I've shown this stamp to colleagues at work and said, this is half the reason we've got a job. Not this particular stamp, but the Ramsar Convention and identifying those crucial areas in the Broads as globally significant in terms of particularly the aquatic ecology and then all the bird life that arises from that. Because again, you don't get shell ducks unless you've got a decent amount of food to eat underwater, so they'll be grazing on some of their water plants and the invertebrates wrapped up in that and dabbling around. So there we go. So from Iran in 1971, we have sort of an awakening, a conservation awakening, should we call it, a bit. But unfortunately, of course, that was only one point in time on a trajectory. So this is a piece of research and a nice infographic diagram from a piece of work stimulated by the World Wildlife Fund. And they were looking at, well, what are the trends globally in terms of biodiversity loss? So here we go, there's 1971 and the Ramsar Convention, so that was set up to highlight where is globally significant in terms of wetland ecology. But even since then, so this is on sort of biodiversity audits and species lists and looking at where biodiversity counts in similar areas. So overall, and again this was publicised in the news and on social media a few years back, there's been about a 70% decrease globally on average of all biodiversity. But actually in freshwaters, if you look at the curve here for freshwaters seem to have suffered far more. So they're sensitive for some reason, far more than the marine systems or the terrestrial systems. So actually freshwaters drag down that overall average. So well, why is it the freshwaters are so sensitive? So if the range and number of species has been hit so hard in freshwaters, why is that? And again, this isn't meant to be depressing, but even from the Ramsar Convention in 1971, that didn't stop anything. The trajectory was still happening. So bringing it back to the local situation again, how is biodiversity loss? What's the pattern of it and how has it occurred locally? So again, this is evidence from Rockland Broad. So this is from, there was a lad who was doing his Masters at the same time I was doing my PhD at University College in London, and we were collecting sediment cores from different places around the Broads, but particularly looking at the plant remains in the sediment cores. So you'll have probably seen things on the TV with ice cores, and you can extract things out of the ice, and marine environment, there's a lot of coring goes on, but you can also do it in freshwater sediments. So Brian Moss, who was at UEA for many years in the 1970s and 80s, did a lot of work on diatoms particularly and other remains in sediment cores. So the team at UCL at that time were particularly keen on looking at the bigger remains of plants and invertebrates and mollusks particularly. So this core from Rockland Broad was taken up in that corner near the bird hide, the RSPB bird hide. So what this shows is this axis basically is depth from the top of the sediment going down. So if you imagine that tube is pushed into the sediment core. So this is sort of depth equaling time basically. So it's a timeline going back into say the early mid 1800s. So at the bottom of the core, there's a lot of remains. So there was a lot of starwort species remains, hornwort, water soldier again, which we saw on the postcard, stoneworts appear occasionally, and lots of water lilies. So as we sort of leap forward, and again the dating of the core, so it's radiocarbon dating is much further back in time. So to date recent sediments, it's looking at lead-210, which is an isotope of lead, and then these other things called spheroidal carbonaceous particles, which is again to do with volcanic tephra, and then there's more modern stuff like that. So you can actually date things based on where these, particularly the isotopes, occur in different layers. So we know that this change here, where everything seems to drop off, is about 1950. And again, from other cores around the Broads, the period between 1950 and 1960 is where the most change happened in the Broads. So it went from being a really water plant rich environment to being relatively few. So it sort of switched from being really diverse to being less diverse. And there's multiple things that happened in the 1950s and 1960s to drive that. Principally eutrophication, so all of the nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, from society, us, all the stuff we send down the drains, the sewage work, agriculture intensified, so all of these things all happened, and this is one of the reasons why freshwaters are so sensitive. They just sort of receive all the runoff of human society, and we go back to these delicate weedy species, they can't cope with too much competition, or all they need is a small amount of the light that they're receiving to disappear. So all of those nutrients drive algae, so all the sort of the microscopic green algae, and that's principally, there's loads of other things that happened as well, but that drop off in species happened in Rockland Broad. So we know we've lost stuff in Rockland, as in other Broads as well. So here's some of the remains. So you've got water lily seed up on the top left. Stoneworts we'll talk more about, but they're an odd type of water plant that aren't actually vascular, so they don't have sort of tubes inside them and normal leaves. They're actually a macroalgae, so their cells are really big for plant cells. We'll see some more pictures of those, and there's hopefully some going around. And then other bits. These are quite good fun. These are probably only about 0.5 millimetre, if that, in size. So these are little spiky hard cells that preserve really well in sediments. So you can find these little spicules, and they are, if you imagine all of them clustered together, it'd be like a pillow. So there's lots of air space, and that's what makes the water lily leaf buoyant and full of air. So these remains you see lots of in the sediment. And then you've got all of your bigger invertebrates and vertebrate remains. So fish scales preserve quite well, mollusks preserve quite well in our hard waters in the Broads. There's lots of calcium carbonate, so they don't tend to dissolve. And then zooplankton. So the Daphnia are the grazing zooplankton that, once eutrophication kicked in, there was lots of green microscopic algae. The Daphnia really went crazy. There was loads of food for them at that time, and you find lots of these after the 1950s. So there's lots of things that corroborate that change in ecological condition in the Broads. So that's the science bit anyway. So yeah, any questions at this point? Is this all sort of making sense? So, what I wanted to do today is really introduce you to some of the species and the water plants themselves, because some of them are pretty special. So, hollyleaf naiad, it looks a bit, I always think, like one of those posh lettuces you get in the leaves you get in the bags, whichever one it is. It looks a bit like that. I did try eating a bit once just for a laugh, but what you can't see on here is all of these. Called holly, I should have twigged. The really sharp spiky bits, and when I swallowed it, it's all really scratchy. So don't eat it, it's no good. But it's only found in the Broads. I probably should have had a license to eat it as well, shouldn't I really? But there you go. So again, this was a species that was sort of described and discovered, should we say, in the Broads in the late 1800s, and people were then, naturalists of the time went to Ickling Broad to go and collect it and find some. So of its day, it was, it had its star turn. There's other species across Europe that are similar, but in the UK, and this species is in parts of Europe as well, but in the UK, it's literally only in the Broads. So Upton Broad, Ickling Broad particularly, it's not very sensitive really in terms of water quality. So you even get it in places like on the sort of middle Bure, so on Hoveden Great Broad, and some of the places that aren't particularly brilliant, but it grows. So that's a genuine Norfolk rarity. And then the stoneworts. So these are the oddities, shall we say, amongst a very odd group anyway. So water plants. Sort of the evolution of how the plants ended up in the water is quite interesting as well, because it's not like all water plants are related and from the same family and they just evolved and they're in water. It's different groups have then gone into the water and become aquatic, as it were. So water beetles are similar. They're from lots of different groups. So when you're actually looking at the taxonomy of water beetles, it's really random. There's sort of one from that group, one from that group. They're just species that have gone to the water and developed that way. And stoneworts, have probably always been aquatic, and their ecology is quite odd. So they either have the male and the female reproductive parts either on one plant, or some species they're separate. So there's a right mix, and they grow in an odd vegetative way. They're a bit like brambles, really. They sort of creep out and grow on top of each other, and they don't. When you pull one out of the water, it doesn't have any strength or structure really at all. So they're odd, they're sensitive, and they only grow in certain water quality conditions. And in the Broads, we've got 5 species, and in the whole of the UK, that they only grow in the Broads really. They're either it's a total stronghold, or like the intermediate stonewort, it only grows then in Hickling and Martham Broad and that area, so on the Upper Thurn. So they require a particular set of conditions that currently exists in a few places in the Broads. So those are some of the specialities, and I've got some of those pressed up as well, so you can have a look afterwards if you're keen. So then in terms of the native species that you might find more or less several more parts of the country. This one grows in the dikes at Wheatfen, so this is one you can sort of see growing locally. So this is flat-stalked pondweed, and again this is a bit more regular. It has a stalk and alternate leaves, quite thick leaves as well. Well, I say quite thick, or about 1 millimetre or 2 millimetres across. But the stem, when you roll it, is flat. You can feel it's flat. Bristly stonewort, again this is one of the rarer ones, but again this grows in Hassingham Broad on the other side of the river, if you ever get over that way. And then unbranched burreed, so this is the sort of ribbonweed, which you actually see in the rivers. So this is around the edge of Rockland Broad in the channels out to the River Yare. And again, this grows, the best place to see this actually is through the city. If you walk along the Wensum near Gerald's, along the printworks there, when you look in the water that is now crystal clear, you can see that and all the bream and fish swimming around. It's great. So those are some of our more frequent species in the Broads, and they're all native, so we've got many records of them going back in time. And then again, a native species we saw the pictures of earlier, and some of the macrofossil remains of the water soldier. So this is the sort of spiky rosette plant, and here it's in flower, which I think why I took the photo. We've got some duckweed as well, you'll be familiar with that. So even though a lot of these water plants grow most of the time in water, they do actually flower as well. So there's the stoneworts aren't flowering plants, but all the others do, and some of the flowers, you'd barely call them a flower, but this one actually has quite a nice flower. So water soldier is native to the Broads, but these plants get cultivated and propagated, and the horticultural trade picks them up and they move around the country. Someone comes to visit you and they go, oh, that's a nice plant in the ditch at the bottom of your garden, Chris. I'll take some home. And this is maybe what happened here. This is the Montgomery Canal over in the northwest, and it's chock full of water soldier, because water soldier isn't native to that part of the UK. So you can get non-native species even in regionally. And then somewhere like a canal, free run, loads of nutrients, happy days. Not many things that control it, not many other plants to outcompete it. And then that starts having an impact on the uses of that type of waterway network. So angling, pleasure boating. So yeah, the concept of native and invasive starts to get a bit blurry here. So that's why I put that slide up. And then we get on to the really nasties, the actual species that have evolved in either tropical or subtropical climates on different continents. So floating pennywort is from South America, and grows in tropical, subtropical habitats, and it grows really quick. One of its features is it makes use of, if you imagine in the flooded Amazon basin, a bit of pennywort settles down, right, we've got to do our thing before the floods come or it dries out. So it grows really quickly, really efficient in terms of absorbing sunlight, absorbing nutrients, and I think in the literature it quotes something like 25 centimetres growth a day, which is huge. Guess what? That's brilliant if you're a horticulturalist and you want to grow a load of plants and sell it quick. And that has been what's happened through the 80s and 90s. Always disbelieve anyone who's trying to sell you a pond plant calling it an oxygenator. They all do that at some point, so it's a bit of a fallacy. And floating pennywort is one of those ones that can fill a ditch, a pond, a river, a canal. There's a canal in the Midlands on the River Soar, and again that bank-to-bank pennywort several miles. So that's a baddie. New Zealand pygmyweed is probably the worst because it's so difficult to get rid of. So again, not evolved in sort of northern temperate climates. This is from New Zealand, and this one has a different metabolism pathway for absorbing and sunlight and generating energy inside to grow. We've done this at work where we tried to get rid of it. It's ended up in a pond. So there's either coming on someone's boots, or this is the worst one, when people move tadpoles and think, oh, we can save the frogs. Don't. It's not a thing. And get, well, let's put some of this nice pond stuff in with it to keep the tadpoles company. It then infests the pond and you can't get rid of it. So this one doesn't glyphosate, if you want to spray it with that, doesn't work. We've covered it with plastic over the whole pond for 6 months. Peel it off and it's still bright green. So even at the lowest levels of light, it can still photosynthesize. So it's really tricky. There was a chemical that was approved for use for controlling it, but that chemical is so bad for everything that was eventually taken off the usage list. So in terms of triple SIs and valuable conservation sites, this one's a real challenge because there's not many ways for site managers to actually get rid of it. So that's one of the reasons why try not to move plants around. If you're digging a pond, the best thing to do is absolutely nothing. Whatever wants to come into it will come in naturally, and it is miraculous how things move around the landscape. And here we're particularly lucky, we've got lots of water features around us. If you dig a new pond, you do not need to move water plants. They will find a way. And again, that's more natural. You're going to then get the local species. And finally, parrot's feather. If you want to see this in real life, if you know the pond at the edge of Rockland on the edge of Bullockshed Lane, the farm, well, I don't know, it's not the farm pond, but it's a pond there. It's full of this. So again, someone's probably tipped out their goldfish and reenacted Free Willy. It's let the goldfish go, but they've moved some of the water plants as well. One of my colleagues once at St Benet's Abbey and some of the dikes around there found a whole load of parrot's feather, but someone had crammed so much into a bucket, when they tipped it out, it was still in a bucket shape. So, this is what people do. They'd clear out the pond. Oh, well, that's not through malice, it's more just being unaware. Let's go and put it back in the environment, but these species really do then have a terrible impact. Because I know the pond has been cleared out several times in a bid to get rid of the parrot's feather, but when I drove past this evening, a couple of hours ago, it's still there. So, it's constant effort, it's a real drain on everyone's time and energy. So yeah, there we go. So there's the bad ones. So we've talked about several challenges in terms of what impacts on freshwater ecology. So just to summarise a few in the Broads, we're all guilty of this. We use far too much water. So in terms of all of the devices we have, running a nice hot bath every night, all of this, it draws that water from the aquifers, the supply has to be there, and you'll have seen it in the news, isn't it? Sites like Catfield Fen suffered then because of abstraction, either for agriculture or potable water. So Anglian Water moved their supply area to help make sure that those protected fen sites don't dry out. As we move into an era of climate change, that predictability of water supply becomes, slightly more variable, shall we say, so we aren't quite as guaranteed of things as we maybe once were. Recreational pressure, people love going out on water, it's brilliant, we want to get out on boats, a lot of people want to go fishing, swimming, just being in the water, all puts extra pressure on the aquatic habitats, because sometimes water plant growth isn't compatible with that other usage. So part of what the Broads Authority does, and part of what I manage in terms of a process, is cutting water plants in the rivers and Broads. So I'm slightly conflicted, but it helps then in terms of the broadland economy and tourism, isn't it? We wouldn't have what we have today without actually the ability to move about on the waterways. So again, that recreational pressure is real. At Wee Fen, we're particularly aware of sea level rise and the impacts because it's tidal at the bottom of the garden. It comes all the way up through the Aire, through Rockland, again, Surlingham. Pub was flooded out, wasn't it? It's a trend, and it's not looking like it's going to suddenly disappear rapidly. So increased sea level and salinisation leads to higher water levels and more salt water penetrating up the rivers. And again, plants are, like any other plant, sensitive to salt. Pressures from development, again, houses next to water have a premium. People want to live by the water. You want to be able to moor your boat up at the end of the garden, get rid of all the growth and stick your decking down, and away you go. Happy days. So that type of development has an impact directly on some of the habitats. So that's another one. Non-native species we've talked about. A lot of these species then are so vigorous and dominant that they outcompete the natural or the native species. So their spread really puts a pressure on the existing water plants that are there. And finally, there's sort of combined impacts of climate change. So variability in rainfall. Is it got to be, well, let's take the next month. Is March going to be a drought month, or is it going to be the wettest on record? Who would like to bet either way? No, we can't, can we? So the variability in rainfall, we've already got increased sea level and salt penetration up the rivers, temperature change as well. Plants respond to temperature. So the warmer it is, some plants will love it, others will think, oh, it's a bit hot for me now, I prefer it when it's colder. So all of those things impact on the freshwater biodiversity and water plants. And again, globally, this has been looked at in terms of what are going to be sort of some of the key changes from all of those combined impacts of climate change. And a nice little diagram here I've taken from this study is the likelihood is where you've got a mixed community of water plants, clearish water and fish communities, all of those things, so temperature, nutrients, variable water supply is likely to lead to the situation where you've got far more green, turbid, algae-dominated water and floating plants on top because they're still getting the light. So that's more likely what's going to happen. So again, that is exactly what happened in the Broads in the early mid-1900s. So again, climate change is going to sort of push us back down that way again. And another feature then of increased temperature in invasive species is water lettuce. So we get sort of subtropical species. Again, it's invaded various in the Everglades. This is they have the jet boats out and go and spray it. It's now in the UK. there's a blob there in near Norwich. So that's a known location on the River Wensum, no, the River Yare near Marston Marsh. So it's probably been someone lobbed it from a pond into the river. This species doesn't really tolerate frost. But how many frosts have we had this year? So, you know, where a hard frost or snow cover would have killed this species off, I don't know, 30 years ago, 40, when did we last have a hard winter? So with that climate variability and the likelihood of frosts not killing off some of these invaders that like it more hot, you're likely to find water lettuce more often. So yeah, this one was a sort of data pull from the end of last year. If I do this talk in 10 years' time, I'll see how many records of water lettuce there are then. So again, we talked about human interactions and how we impact on the aquatic environments. This is an aerial photo from the Barton Broad. So this is where dredging's happened. So nice squared off, neat dredging there took place. And the barrier is one that excluded fish. So the fish were whipped out of that area as an experiment to show that if you remove some of the nutrients and you remove some of the fish that eat the zooplankton, you can actually generate clear water quite quickly. So if you can barrier an area off, or even in an enclosed pond, take some of the mud away, take some of the fish away, and some of those factors that maintain those conditions where you've got cloudy, turbid water, you can actually generate the types of conditions where water plants can flourish. And this barred area was on the Neatishead Arm, and yeah, there's been multiple plant species found from that area. So the seeds in the sediment emerged and grew. There it is, there's the Broads Authority's brand new water plant harvester. So in terms of the navigable channels, we've got 3 of these vessels and they sort of ply up and down. 15 years ago there was one of these vessels on the Broads, and it only really worked in the sort of area near Martham and Somerton, occasionally on the River Bure up near Coltishall, and then now we've got 3, and they're on all the main rivers, all the way from Beccles up to Geldston, pretty much everywhere in the Upper Thurn, including Hickling Broad. So all of those navigable channels now have far more water plants, which is a success story in terms of the ecology and the water quality, because the clarity of the water is now so much better. I talked about if you through the River Wensum in Norwich, through the summer, you can see the bottom of the river, you can see the fish. So that you know, there has been ecological improvement. Water quality is fantastic, but that leads to far more water plant growth. So in terms of maintaining the water channels and making sure that the boats can get through, we do then go in and manage those habitats. And then again, we talked about runoff and agriculture and sediment. This is a photo from Horsey Mere. So this is where a drain comes down into Horsey, and it drains a big area that is pump drained, and that releases iron that's in the soils, and that comes out in suspension. And you can imagine what that does to plant growth. It's like sticking a tarpaulin over your greenhouse. So Horsey Mere doesn't have that huge a variety of water plants where, say, Hickling Broad or Martham Broad, which are very close, same water quality, do. So this is where society's land use, you know, we demand it of farmers that we want those products and food. That all has an impact on the aquatic environment. So that's what we do as a cheerful bunch of people on the world. But you know, this isn't new. This is a slide from the 1930s. So this was I suppose it was the Port and Haven Commissioners, or whatever the previous versions and incarnations of the Environment Agency Broads Authority was back in the day. So steam dredger, and this is the sort of the fleet dike going off from Rockland Broad. Bizarrely, if you're on a boat here, it looks very similar today. So, you know, nearly 90 years on, whatever, it looks very similar. So again, we've been modifying the landscape. You could say the Broads area is totally man-made anyway. So it's a managed landscape, but it's the quality of the water and the biodiversity in it that it gets impacted. Again, things don't change a lot. This is one of my team who were dredging on the River Bure, but it just goes to show the techniques are still there, the management's still needed to maintain these lowland river systems, and it's just the equipment's changed really, but same process. So we're still having an impact, and there's trade-offs on all these things. If we want water flowing out through Yarmouth, we need to dredge, but that has an impact on some of the river life. So this is where we then start thinking, well, they've got all these impacts, but what are we losing? Well, what's the value of a healthy aquatic system? What does it do for us? Well, for drinking water, that's fairly fundamental. The irrigation supply, we want to grow food, and that needs water. Transport as well, I've sort of included that as more recreational, which is more of a cultural thing, but there is some transport elements in the Broads still. So that's what the aquatic environment provides. Culturally then, this is the recreation and fun stuff, or angling, boating, nature enjoyment. We all enjoy nature, so this is what we get when we go and have a look at a pond or peer in the ditch next to the Hellington Reserve or whatever. So this is what we get out of it. Slightly spiritual element to that, if you sit and think about it for a while. People come on holiday to the Broads, don't they? The Broads are traded off these characteristics for years. So whilst people need boats to get out to see these things, actually they're coming for entirely valid reason. They want to come and witness the Broads, and it's fantasticness. And then educational, a bit like tonight. Hopefully you'll go away learning something. If not, I haven't done a very good job. So the other aspect is that's the regulating function. If you think of the waterways and the aquatic system, it's a bit like sort of the kidneys of the environment, if I can stretch that metaphor. So it actually purifies the water, the nutrients get cycled, organic matter, so there's sort of the breakdown of the leaves and things, is that cycle of carbon. A healthy, robust system is one that can sort of shug off some of these invaders that come in, but if you're sort of been enfeebled and weakened by various batterings, you're more likely to have water lettuce or floating pennyworth come and invade you. And sediment stability is a good one there. All of this water plant growth actually stabilises sediment. So, you get one big storm coming through and all the sediment doesn't get whipped up and sent downstream. The water plants actually try and keep it all there and control these things. So a healthy system is one that regulates and it doesn't lose all of its goodness and away. So that's what freshwater ecosystems do for us, and that's valuable. Where else are you going to get your drinking water from? Where else are you going to go and recreate? So this is the value in the Broads. Well, there's multiple ways in which you can value that, but that's more for the academic sphere. But it then comes into policy. You can start adding the costs and benefits together. So again, what's the evidence of some of this change? I've talked about all this change, but these are just the odd pictures. So in terms of water quality, the colleague Chris is here from the Environment Agency, or ex-Environment Agency. So Chris was involved for many years in terms of water quality and biological monitoring. Again, he taught me many things. So this is a photo from Ranworth, and you can see that, well, I'll give you a clue. The water quality is not very good here. So you've got lots of algae, and you can sort of see it from space almost. So water quality monitoring is that instantaneous, so you need to do it a lot, keep it up. You can detect how much salt, how much phosphate, how much nitrogen is in that water at any one time. And then the water plants, though, they're there all the time. So they're integrating all of this water quality, all those parameters all the time. And the Broads Authority has been monitoring water plants in the Broads for over 40 years now. And Broads Authority and predecessor bodies. So we've got really good knowledge of the current situation in the Broads area. So in terms of water plant sampling, then there's you can do this in a structured way that's repeatable. So this is Alderfen Broad, and it's just an example of the sort of the gridded out points where my colleagues go and take those samples. And when you look across the whole of the Broads, we can work out how many samples we need to take to be representative. So we've got a robust methodology, and then you need trained individuals to actually go out and do this. So it needs the skills to be able to identify the plants. My colleague Hannah on the left lives in Bramerton, so she's sort of involved locally as well. And so yeah, identifying, I think they're particularly focusing on some of the stoneworts. They're quite tricky to identify. You have to look at little hairs and spines on them, so intense concentration there. And so what are the types of environments they're sampling in? So back to Rockland Broad. And this photo was one from 1989. I think I robbed this one off Google Earth. And I guess it's fairly familiar. There's sort of smattering of water lilies. The water, the actual, it looks as if the water's fairly clear at this stage on this photo. You can sort of see down into the sediment. But from some of our records, there wasn't that, in the 80s and early 90s, there wasn't that many species in Rockland. So it suffered from eutrophication. And again, we go back to that little diagram where you've just got the floating species on the top and not a lot else underneath. And that was the situation back then. And again, from the sediment cores, we'd seen that a lot of the species had sort of dropped off. So all of those submerged species, and again, in the cards that are going around, you've got a different range of sort of plants that grow up from the sediment surface. So we jump forward to 2014 and slightly different angle. But again, the water quality looks quite clear again. There's still a good range of water lilies. So have things got better? Possibly. So this graph sort of then really shows us. So the picture was 2014. So we got lots of water lilies, which is the orange colour. And the blue is the scientific term here, vascular macrophytes. So that's the plants with stems that grow up from the sediment bed. So you know, it bubbled along. This sort of pattern up until about 2019 goes all the way back to 2018, really, if we wanted to extend that. 2018? 1989, sorry. There we go. Get my dates muddled up. So it goes back 30 odd years. Rockland Broad sort of bubbled along. It was fair to middling, you'd call it. But then something happened in 2020 that stimulated, shall we say, a bit of a shift. Something kick-started, the water quality improved. It was very clear for that summer. What did everyone do in the summer of 2020? Diddly squat, did we? We couldn't go anywhere. So I'm hypothesising wildly here, but was there something then that we all did that didn't, for some reason, something happened with water quality? I still don't know what it is. This pattern's replicated in other places as well in the Broads, but basically the water plant abundance shot up. And last year was crazy. Far more water plants, and then we're starting to get stoneworts. So I talked about the sensitive, rarer species. They've appeared in Rockland Broad, which is great. And you've got a sort of more of a mix, more of an even mix. So you've got a bigger abundance, bigger volume, so the water plants really took off. And again, if you've been out on the Broad, if you've got a boat, or if you've been from the bird hide and looked out, basically, most of the Broad now is covered in water lilies, and the real difference is, underneath that, if you were to chuck your sampling rake or have a dibble around, pull your mud weight up if you're on a boat, there's loads of other plants as well. So pretty much the whole of Rockland Broad is now covered in water plants. So that's a really good story. There's not very often you get sort of biodiversity positives. And here's the species list. It's crazy long. So we've got, where is it? There's one of the stoneworts, pointed stonewort. You've got yellow water lilies, obviously the most dominant. But then you've got, well, Nuttall's waterweed isn't actually native, but it's been here so long, it might as well be. Spiked water milfoil is a species you get in sort of slightly brackish water. This one, World water milfoil, is really brilliant. Again, even in my working lifetime water plant sampling, World water milfoil was only in some of the really good ditches on grazing marshes in the Broads. So around Higham Holmes, around Hassingham. So it was in the area, but it wasn't in any of the Broads or in any of the rivers. Now we've found it in the River Wensum and Yare, pretty much all the way from the football ground right down to Posick Viaduct, the flyover. So That's amazing, that really is. And then it's in the Rockland Broad, and then loads of other species. So you've got all the other little species filling in the gaps. So say maybe 30 years ago you'd only have 5 species, and it would mainly be water lily, filamentous algae, and some of the sort of more common rough and tough species. Now you've got, look, 20 odd. So that's great. Oh yeah, so this is my picture of Welsh water milfoil. Possibly the worst picture you could ever take of a water plant. It's out of focus, but I think this is in one of the channels at Wheat Fen. So Rebecca, if you're out sampling, look out for this one. It's a cracker. Terrible photo. So this is me getting all excited. We found Welsh water milfoil. So that's what it looks like. It looks very much like some of the non-native species you can buy still. Unfortunately, in some of the aquatic, especially if you go on eBay, you can buy all sorts. So, you know, they're in the same family as some of these invasive species, but this one's a native one that was really rare, and now it's come back. So in Rockland Broad, have we almost gone full circle? Have we done full loop? Are we getting back to this picture from the early 1900s? All we need now, and the first person who spots water soldier on Rockland Broad, I will buy them a pint. There. I've got witnesses, it's true. Unless you all go out on one massive boat. 1 pint. There we go. So yeah, Rockland Broad, the good news story in the Broads, we'll call it. But it's still sensitive. These things could turn backwards. You know, all it takes is, who knows, you know, big saltwater event, Whitlingham might suddenly discharge some nasties. Who knows? So in terms of case studies, the Hickling Broad, again, the same timeline. This is abundance of water plants. Again, Hickling, bubbled along, 2020. So again, same methodologies, you know, so we got the rigor there, and, you know, it wasn't just someone who went out and they couldn't score something low, and they could only count above 5 or something. So we know the methodology is sound. And again, the stoneworts then are dominant. So it's a bit different to Hickling. It's not the same sort of mix of species in the Upper Thurn and Hickling Broad, but that's because it's saltier. So the salinity in those broads is high because they're so near the coast. It actually draws through the aquifer, the salinity, and into the drainage ditches that then get pumped into the broads. So the range of species that can tolerate that is much smaller, and stoneworts can tolerate that salt. But even so, there's been an uplift. If you've been out on the Norfolk Wildlife Trust trip boat at Hickling, one thing that they struggle with is sometimes their boat gets stuck in the stonewort. So even the trip boat that's taking people out to go and marvel at nature gets stuck because the plant growth is so vigorous. So again, this is another one of Mike Page's aerial photos from Hickling, and the water is so, this was 2023, the water's so clear you can see all the way through, and basically this brown colour, it looks brown, but it's all water plants. These are huge beds of stoneworts either side of here's the channel, so that's the marked channel the boats go through. You've got areas where it's a bit patchier. This area is interesting. So we said about the impact of sediment. This is actually, I think, sediment that's getting blown around from the wind-induced waves in the middle of the Broad. Maybe the wind was coming from the northwest that day, or I don't know. But that's a suspended sediment that's impacting then on the water plants. So again, the Broads Authority's work through this area has been focused on dredging the channel, because that's where the loose sediment focuses. And again, we'd finished a dredging program in 2020. So again, this is where dredging can actually be a benefit, because you're actually removing some of that loose sediment with the nutrients in. So here, Hickling Broad, if you want to go and see water plants, go out on the Norfolk Wildlife Trust trip boat. It's fantastic. So yeah, well, what does that environment look up close and personal? So if you find ways of looking underwater, you can get sort of bathyscopes, or you can make your own little tube with a glass thing at the end. If it's on a still day, you can just look through it anyway. But if it's a bit rougher, it's worth it, because you've got different stonewort species. So these ones have got the big long bracts. These ones are a bit tighter. You've got mare's tail. So even in this whole photo, I think there was something like 6 species, which is crazy. So in Hickling, yeah, that plant growth is over the whole of the bottom of the lake, which is what you would expect. In shallow lakes globally, water plants dominate. That is what they do. So for a shallow lake like any of the Broads we have here in Norfolk and Suffolk to not be fully filled up with water plants, it's odd. So, you know, it's the natural state of things. The water plants will occupy that space. So again, this is a bit of a sort of scientific take on the macrophytes' adaptations to life, and particularly salt concentration. So again, this was a nice picture I found from this study in 2023. And basically, if you imagine the gradient going across to the right is most salty over that side and least salty over here. So at the moment, we're probably in this sort of situation in Rockland, if we take the Broads as an example of where you've got different salinities. And at the moment in Hickling, we're more like down here. So you've got a smaller range of species, but they're very specialist species, and they're on the edge of their tolerance as well. It wouldn't take a lot to be more salty, and then suddenly you've got no species. So salt in itself is okay up to a point, and then you start losing species rapidly, and then the system becomes slightly less stable. So salt is another impact and influence on the water plant communities in the Broads. So thinking about how we as society interact with all these water plants, so I'm guessing a lot of us in this room are motivated by the sort of the wildlife side of it. Some of you may have boats. I've got a rowing boat. I like going out on boats. Working in the Broads, you can't help it go out in a boat. But water plants do then have an impact on recreation, and there's safety fears, and people just don't like it. It impacts on some of the race sailing. So at the same time as there's been this sort of ecological recovery, that ramps up the number of negative impacts that people experience, because I guess a lot of the bigger vessels that we get now have been used to sailing and operating in waters that haven't had water plants in the last 40 odd years. So the native species returning is sort of the change. You know, no one likes change, do they? So that's a challenge. And again, the Broads Authority has to try and work a way through this that A, conserves the biodiversity, B, maintains the economy locally, and C, allows people to get out and recreate in that way. Again, another example, this was Hopton Little Broad. Again, a Broad that's not had water plants for donkey's years, decades, and now it's got water plants returning. So the sailing club that use that area is quite quiet and safe. So again, you've got children's groups who use it to learn to sail. So that, again, they're impacted now, and timing, you know, the water plants come and go in a season, but typically the water plants grow when everyone wants to be out on their boat when it's nice and warm. So again, it's a timing challenge, and some of these places are the only places that the water plants can grow. So we've got hollyleaf naiad in this Broad. So you've got a species that only grows in the Broads, and you know, what do we do? Go in and cut it? Is that sustainable? Is it going to protect the species? These things are there. So yeah, well, what other things can happen in terms of sailing? Is there different ways of, you know, dagger boards, raked keels, stuff like that? What ways can we sort of still interact in the environment and not remove it? So in terms of policy implications then, what does all this cost us, particularly the invasives? So again, this is a big figure. So all biological invasions in the UK over a sort of 30 odd year period, 40 year period, 3.42 million. So if you think about Japanese knotweed, how much that takes to remove, American mink, crayfish, all of these things have a negative impact somewhere, and it typically costs someone something. So again, this was a study that calculated all of this. So for the aquatic species, it was possible to actually work out which of the species have cost us the most. So the biggest proportion of cost of aquatic species then is floating pennywort. So that's the one that really grows quickly, and it's impacted waterways, it impacts water intakes, it occupies fishing ponds and things like that. So that's the one that's caused the most problem in terms of economic impact. So this is economic impact of society as a whole, not pure just for conservation. So the Canadian pondweed as well, that's been around for a long time, so I guess that's accumulated a lot of impacts in a lot of places. So that's one of the downsides of allowing these species to spread and not controlling them. Equally then, we've talked about the impact of water plants, where they return to, the recreational impacts, where people have been used to recreating without them. So how do we navigate that in terms of our societal response? So where does this take us? How do we tread a path where we've still got healthy biodiversity, maintain some of the gains we've achieved in the last few decades, in the face of some big challenges? So increased salinity and sea level rise is going to keep coming. So how do we maintain freshwater habitats in the Broads? Do we need to be digging some more Broads further inland? What do we do? You can't recreate deep peat marshes. How can you actually replace like for like? So that's a challenge. Species protection, which is the species where if we lost them in the Broads would be the hardest to replace. It costs far more to bring them back and translocate them. So prevention is better than waiting for it to go wrong. Again, in terms of sustainable management, we talked about water plant cutting in the rivers. How can we do that in a way that sort of doesn't denude the rivers and maintain some of those regulating functions we talked about, keeping the sediment stable, providing habitat for fish and birds? So how can we do that and have recreation and boating? Impact from non-native species, so thinking about what's on the horizon. Water lettuce, what do we need to do? Do we need people to be super aware of what it looks like? I apologise for not bringing you some pressed water lettuce so you can all be more aware of what it looks like. But yeah, it's keeping your eyes peeled. There is floating pennywort not a million miles from Rockland Broad. Low common area, there's some ditches and ponds there with pennywort in. So yeah, it's not a huge leap of imagination to see it jump across. And novel pollutants, there's always stuff we've been chucking in the water for centuries, or things that some new wonder product that we then go 10 years later, wish we hadn't done that. So what's the next lot of pollutants on the horizon that's going to impact on the freshwater environment? So there's been a lot of press about studies recently of flame retardants and neonicotinoids. All of these things have an impact somewhere in the aquatic environment that then has a ripple impact on water plants. So this is where some of the research is probably going to go. So how do we wrap all this up and give you some hope for the future? I'm just trying to remember if all of these are hopeful. But yes, there's a bit of a mix. So again, we've had some gains over the last few decades, but the challenges are still there. So again, that is a positive one. Water clarity has improved. Go to some of these places. You can get up to Somerton, in the city, particularly May and June when the water seems to go clearest. If you can get to the River Bure at Coltishall as well, that's fantastic. So there's loads of areas where you can get out on the Broads, even in the middle of Wroxham actually. It's bizarre. Last year I went through Wroxham and you could see the bottom of, you can see Coke cans and crisp packets from the 1980s. Thinking, Smith's crisps. So yeah, that's happened. So that's been through the investment of the water companies, stripping out phosphate from the sewage treatment, agricultural sensitivity. So farmers in Norfolk understand that they have an impact as well. So all of these schemes and inputs have has an impact on the water environment. Trouble is, the invasive species side of it, we aren't winning. They're still popping up in areas we don't want them. There's still new species coming on the market, as it were. So, you know, it's vigilance and swift action wherever we can. Sea level rise is the biggie. You know, the model predictions for temperature increase, and so this is where it all gets a bit depressing. By, you know, 2100, will the sea level be 1.5 meters, or will it only be 50 centimetres higher? Either way, you know, Rockland and Wheatfen are going to look very different. How do we prepare for that? Well, what do we need to be resilient for those changes that are going to come in the next few decades? What do we need to protect in the rivers, and what could we let function more naturally? So there's some of the big challenges in the Broads as a whole. Again, it's about evidence, really, isn't it? It's where can science play a part to guide policy making and public awareness? So, you know, you can have all the science. Well, it happens in all spheres. COVID's been one example. You can have all the evidence you like, but if people get it in their head, they don't want it, and they don't want it. So yeah, how do you bring people with you? So that's where you need good communication, decent evidence that people trust, politicians you can trust. You know, it's how do we achieve all of this, people? And again, thinking about the water environment and the catchment, if you think about Rockland Broad, you can't just myopically focus on Rockland Broad and think, what do we need to do for Rockland Broad? It isn't. It's what do we do all the way back to Dereham, because that water comes all the way through the catchment. So it might be, you know, a farmer in Dereham needs to do something different, but it's actually the biodiversity in the Broads that benefits. How does the biodiversity in the Broads pay the farmer in Dereham? It's an odd one, isn't it? So where the benefits are felt is often not generating a tangible direct income. So this is similar to many things in life. Similar with flood defences, isn't it? It's, you know, someone may need to have a more naturally functioning wetland somewhere, maybe down near Yarmouth, who knows, which then relieves flooding further upstream. But how does that benefit transfer? How do you set those schemes and policies up so that, you know, there aren't unfair winners and losers in this? So that's all from me. I'll leave you on that note. So any questions? Peter.
If your weed comes,
yep.
What do you do with the weed afterwards?
Largely it goes in heaps on the bank. So this has been a sort of custom and practice thing that's developed over years, and say 20 years ago it was a little heap the size of that table. Now we're in a position where you've got a run of bank maybe 200 metres long where you've got the heap. So yeah, we're desperately looking for beneficial reuse of that. There's a few areas where we can offload it and the farmer can then pick it up and put it on their muck-heap and spread it. So water plants, when you take them out of the water though, they dry out and shrink to not a lot. So it's not like hedge cuttings and grass cuttings that sit there for ages. They do shrivel away, which is annoying, because if you could put them in an anaerobic digestion or something like that, you could imagine that could be a sustainable crop. But water plants don't have those qualities. So it tends to shrink away quickly, which is why you can put it in heaps. But the more and more volume of water plants each year is a challenge. So yes, we're looking for different ways of using that. But largely it's a friendly local farmer who'll pick it up, stick it on their heap of other stuff and spread it. So that's the best way.
I recently installed a small pond on my allotment.
Fantastic.
All I put in it was water.
Yep.
Just water. And a few ladders for frogs to get in and out.
Uh-huh.
And from what I gather, I've done the right thing.
Yeah, perfect.
And I shouldn't put any plant in there.
What you'll find is either stuff will... Well, I've done it with jars of water, and you end up with zooplankton, water fleas, just appear. I don't know how it happens. So it was either a mucky jar or so yeah, things will find their own way. I don't know if there's other ponds on the allotment or close by or.
One little point, the pond, I originally tried a concrete thing, but it leaked, and so I've used a child's play paddle.
Okay, yeah.
And it's made out of plastic, doesn't it?
And so did you put any sort of sand in the bottom or soil in it, or?
I tried to put some gravelly stuff in it.
Yeah, okay.
And I intend to do some more.
Yeah.
But I just wonder whether the actual plastic of the play thing is.
I think that, yeah, was it brand new or was it an old one?
Oh, quite old.
So he's probably been in the sun for a long while. I think any of the sort of volatile stuff would have probably have gone by that. Yeah, well done, you've reused.
One of the couple of little things, I just listening to you, I realised I picked up some seaweed when I was walking from Hoare to Sheringham the other week.
Right, okay.
And I suddenly realised it's still in my pocket and dried up. And then it occurred to me, could that seaweed be damaging if I was to put it in Clairvaux?
What you mean, somewhere else in the country, or just between Sheringham and Joma?
In my pond, but then thinking that, I then suddenly thought,
that's the sea.
What is salt? Where does it come from? What is it? What is salt?
So, well, I suppose salt is in the sea because of millennia and millennia of evaporation, so that concentration. So yeah, your seaweed wouldn't grow in your freshwater pond, so it would go funny.
Conversely, freshwater plants won't grow in the sea.
Exactly. So yeah, you've got that gradient, like we showed, where some species are tolerant of salt, and typically in the marine environment, you haven't got many vascular plants, kelp, and it's a different environment. So your seaweed wouldn't grow in your pond. So don't worry, you could chuck it in, but it'd be totally useless.
Would it be possible to create a plant which will desalinate, which will protect a pond from salination?
Well, ponds don't tend to in your isolated pond, the risk of...
More with the Broads. Suppose
right, okay.
They're getting salinated by the rising sea level.
No, plants wouldn't do that function. They don't pump salt out. They just deal with it. They don't get rid of it.
Invent a clever biological
No.
species.
But it's an interesting concept. I like it, but no. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That's right.
Can you comment on Himalayan balsam?
Yeah. So yeah, again, what tends to happen with biological invasions is once they've established and been in a place for so long, eventually they're so widespread, how would you ever get rid of them? And then they become a bit more naturalised, and perhaps the impacts lessen over time. I don't know if there's a sort of curve of impact where it tails off. But one of the things that has happened with Himalayan balsam is the researchers have been looking at what the natural there's not predators because it's a rust, but it's a fungus that naturally checks the population in the Himalaya, and that has been reproduced, should we say, and bred in the UK, and there's been trials of letting that out into the environment. So it's been rigorously, so it's CABI who do this, which is the Agricultural Bureau of something or other, and so they've had to do all the trials to make sure then it doesn't impact on carrots and other crops and things like that. So yeah, it's not the cane toad scenario. So with Himalayan balsam, yes, it's still a problem. The amount of active pulling and control of it has dropped off, but like the RSPB, for example, just don't bother because it's just there. What are you going to do? Go into a reed bed in the middle of the breeding season and disturb that and pull it all out? So it's one of those ones where it's been here so long, it's sort of become part of the landscape. Saying that though, if you've got a particular river catchment, it's never had it in it, and one or two appear, whip it out as quick as you can. So it's that establishment, and the seeds last a long time as well, and they travel downriver as well. So yeah, it's a pain. But on the plus side, beekeepers do love it because it flowers at a particular time when there's gaps in other nectar. So it's not all bad.
Dan, in your discussion and coverage of the Norfolk Broads, you made no reference to the dredging which took place to remove the mercury pollution which was in there, and that was in the 80s, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yes. So yeah, if people are aware, there was a particular period when mercury contamination came through the sewage network, through Whitlingham sewage works, and then out and into the river. So that plume of mercury contamination entered the sediments, pretty much affected everywhere from Posick all the way down to Cantley, and that you can still go out and find mercury today. And some of the dredging that has taken place has removed some of that, and the Broads Authority have got the tip site up near Posick that material goes to. but the dredging that's taken place has never removed all of it. So now it's sort of in the, sort of buried in the lower sediments. And every time we dredge in anywhere in the air now, we go out and test it beforehand, work out what the concentrations are. But again, the good news is it's sort of dispersed a bit. So the sediments where originally there was very high concentrations in the surface, that sort of spread and, well, it's diluted it basically. And some of that has washed out and then gone further down and out to sea. But in terms of water plants directly, mercury wouldn't have a negative impact on the water plants. It's more likely to then accumulate in the invertebrates and have an impact on fish and vertebrates rather than the water plants. So yeah, there's still controls and protection in place to make sure it's not spread around. So and luckily the source was turned off. So yeah, it's one of those legacies we still deal with. Chris.
Thanks, Don. Has the water temperature changed much in recent years? In the same way the sea temperature is changing quite rapidly now. Is it happening with freshwaters as well?
Yeah, so Chris's query is about the evidence of temperature change in the Broads. Do you know what? I've never looked. I think it's one of those things, there's so much variability, actually picking out the trend, you'd need to be a better statistician than me. So it's probably there, but again, that's not something I'm overly familiar with. Like you say, there's other examples, air temperature, and but yeah, actually water temperature, I'm not so sure, but it's likely, and it's probably more that the maximum temperature's gone up. So on them really hot days when it's 35 or over 30 degrees, the shallow waters in the Broads, they'll heat up really quickly. So that's one of the features of they're quite responsive to that temperature increase. Equally, there's not been much ice cover over the winters. So, just from those two things, it's probably dragging the average up.
We came to Rockland in 1986-87.
Yep.
And on Rockland Broads, there were 60 in the wintertime, 60 or even 70 swans feeding on the Broad. And then it went down 10 years ago. We were lucky to see 4, 5 or 6, as few as that. And we're now getting many more. I've seen more than 25 this past year. So what you've shown us really explains what's happened, enriching the environment. So that's terrific news.
There we go. Well, that's fantastic observation.
Is water plants are green, so that assumes there's chlorophyll in the water plant. Does photosynthesis take place underwater?
It does.
How does it happen?
Well, I guess the actual photosynthetic process in the cell happens similar to terrestrial plants. They might have a slightly different mix of the pigments because it's not just chlorophyll that is the active pigment. Tony, you may know the answer to this. I'm going to pick on the audience.
How long have you got?
But I think in answer to your question there, it is yes. It is very similar to
the size.
Yeah.
They get their carbon dioxide in solution.
Yes. So that's the key bit, isn't it?
Bicarbonate rather than carbon dioxide, but the process is very, very similar.
Yep.
A lot of them are like some of them are like the crassula that you mentioned earlier, the pygmy weed, in which they have this different form of photosynthesis, which enables them to fix the carbon in the absence of light, because they fix it into an organic acid. And then when it's light, they release it from that and refix it using the normal carbon dioxide, the normal photosynthetic apparatus.
Yeah.
So it means they can operate in what is a very low carbon dioxide environment, because it's a way of concentrating it. Is a sort of the simplest way I can explain it. But the answer is yes, they're doing it, and they do it very effectively.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. An excellent question, Michael. Any other questions then, or any other thought? Oh, we go to the back.
Have there been any changes over the decades in terms of agricultural runoff that's been monitored within Broadland or within the waterways?
Yes, I nearly spent the time and pulled together a graph to show the phosphate concentration, because it's phosphate really that drives a lot of the aquatic ecology change, because it's phosphate that is naturally most limiting in sort of fresh waters in temperate climates. So where you've got phosphate artificial phosphate fertilisers and particularly detergents in dishwashers and washing machines, that's an unnatural source of phosphate that then ends up in our water system. So yes, this is particularly well researched, really, that phosphate side of things. What I didn't do was show you the graphs. So since the 1980s, when a lot of this research, and again it was some of Tony's colleagues at UEA who sort of were very focused on this, Brian Moss being one of them, and Chris and I's colleague Jeff Phillips. So that work has been ongoing since the 80s, and phosphate is now much lower level where the microscopic algae is less prevalent, and that's what's allowed these water plants to grow up. So yeah, I've skipped that bit of detailed water chemistry for you, because water plants are the better indicator. Or swans, actually, Michael, might be the... and again, yeah, the bird observations have been very similar in Hickling. So, you know, you've got big coot numbers again, tufted duck and swans, which are all utilising that habitat, if not directly eating the water plants that are growing. So Norfolk Wildlife Trust bird counts have gone through the roof in Hickling. And there was a question here, yes.
You spoke about community engagement and taking the public with you.
Yeah.
I wondered how much the press were helping or hindering. I did notice that on the slides you put up referred to weeds.
Indeed.
Time,
yeah.
With negative connotations that carries with it.
So I guess it's the media's job to be fairly reactionary, isn't it? That's what sells papers and gets clicks on the internet. So that is a challenge, because it creeps into misinformation. I suppose once you actually read the article, often it balances out a bit and it's not quite as inflammatory as the headline and the miserable faced person looking glum. You know, it's usually the real situation is usually far more nuanced. And that's, again, it's a challenge for sort of science or even semi-science communication. How can you get that message across without either being, you know, really detailed and really scientific, which most people go, what? Or oversimplifying it and not actually getting the essence across. So there is that fine line. The media often doesn't help, that's all I can say. So it's, again, where you source your news from, you know. Don't just read the EDP.
Just one last little comment.
Yeah.
I I'm in Norwich, near a new nature reserve.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they've got 5 cattle on it, I discovered.
Indeed.
Cattle.
Yeah, yeah.
And I discovered the other day that they've got these collars on. And these collars are they're monitored by a daily satellite.
Yep.
And if they go or step in the wrong direction, they get a message telling them they've got to stay. So I was thinking, can we monitor plants by using a daily satellite?
How do we? Yeah. So in terms of the GPS, did you see my colleagues, when they're going out sampling, they go back to pretty much the same spot every time, and that's through GPS technology. So in a similar way, they're ensuring that they're carrying out a similar methodology in similar habitats every time. So that's one way. The way we record all of those species records, all the dots where water lettuce was around the country, again, that's where people are logging either on their phones, because you can get GPS, you know, not many people go back to the OS map and get the grid reference that way anymore, do they? So yeah, that's one way in which that technology is helpful.
And just one silly question, is there any connection between water lettuce and iceberg lettuce?
I've not tried eating water lettuce. Maybe you'd like to try.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. I was going to say thank you for Dan for that really excellent talk, really interesting talk. Give a nice round of applause.
Thank you.